Hello and welcome back to the Electric Election Podcast and Road Trip. I am the executive producer, Saul Spady. I'm alongside our host, Benjamin Backer. He is the executive director of the Conservation Coalition. We are joined by Brian Yablonski. He is the executive director of PERC. Brian, where are we? Can you just introduce our viewers to this incredible expanse?
We're in the wilds of Montana. This is private conservation at its best. We are on Ted Turner's Flying D Ranch outside of Bozeman, Montana. It's about 113,000 acres, which is a big ranch here in Montana. We're looking out over a couple bull bison right now, so we're being careful. We may talk a little soft, not to agitate them, but Ted is one of the leading private conservationists in all of America, and has really done a huge job in terms of bison conservation. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And the ranch essentially spans two river drainages. We have the Gallatin River that borders one side of the ranch, and the Madison River that borders the other side of the ranch. So it's a real special place here in Montana.
I'm really looking forward to diving in on the private conservation side, but before we do that, I mean, the elephant in the room, or the smoke in the room, is the smoke behind us right now. Wildfires have been ravaging our country for the past couple of weeks, and they seem to be getting worse in some areas over this week as well. It's talked about a lot kind of in the climate change world about what we can do in the next 10 to 50 years to prevent climate change. What can we do in the next 5 years to prevent these, catastrophic wildfires from happening, and why are they happening?
Yeah, and these wildfires release hundreds of millions of tons of carbon as well, so there's a threat to the climate there. No, I'm with you. Climate change is real, and there's a long-term solution that we need to focus on, but there's the here and now that we really need to focus on, and it's kind of appropriate. We're here in Montana, right at the border at Idaho. I'm going to take you back about 100 years here. The Forest Service, this fledgling agency that was created by Theodore Roosevelt, and he appointed his good friend Gifford Pinchot, who was one of the first foresters in America, helped found the Yale Forestry School. The Forest Service was really trying to find a mission, like what do we do, what's our meaning, what's our purpose. Forest protection was a big issue at the time. And in 1910, there was a huge wildfire, 3 million acres, right at the Idaho-Montana border, not too far away from here. It was given a name, the Big Burn. And that became the Forest Service mission. The Forest Service mission became fire suppression. Their whole being and existence was fire suppression. They had this mantra that they had to put out a fire. Any fire that was identified from all these mountain lookouts had to be put out by 10 a.m. the next day. That's how serious they took it. And it really created this culture of only you can prevent forest fires, Smokey the Bear, that fire's this bad thing, and we're just going to suppress fires. So, when we look out here, we can actually see Forest Service land that abuts Ted Turner's ranch here. The forests are thick with fuel. We haven't allowed nature, lightning, to sort of do its thing, which helps clear forests when you have these lightning strikes. We haven't managed the forests to replicate lightning and historic, sort of opening of canopies and whatnot. So what you have are these small diameter timber, thick forests that are ready to go up in flames without management. So what we've really been having to do is sort of unteach ourselves here and realize that man needs to kind of go in and replicate nature here a little bit and really start clearing out the underbrush, start clearing out some of these small diameter trees to open up the canopy so you have a more healthy forest, but you can really reduce the risk of massive conflagrations.
Well, that's what the science says, right? Like, that is exactly what the science says, and scientists have said for a long time that yes, climate change will make these fires worse, but that, to our conversation this morning, no amount of money can be spent on climate change to prevent these from happening, because it is the here and now.
It's the issue.
And so why haven't we been able to progress on forest management in the past, especially 10 or 15 years, when the science has been saying that we should do that?
Yeah, there's just been resistance. I mean, it's easy to say, we don't have enough money to go and clear the forest. But a lot of it has been resistance from a number of organizations that are just opposed to us going in and sort of managing the forest. So when you have forest management projects that come up, a lot of times you'll have organizations that will sue to stop those projects. We have a NEPA process, a federal permitting process that you have to go through that, takes thousands of pages and, years to get through the process. If that permitting to do the management gets through the process and then somebody comes and sues and you get a judge to stop the process too, it is just cumbersome and hard to do these projects.
We don't have 2 years for a permit process to go through. It feels like we have, months. What can we do to quicken this process and to actually bring in the best practices from people like Ted Turner, who maintains a beautiful ranch, and actually get them into the national forest lands behind us that are in danger?
No, it's a great question. There are a handful of things that are happening, and PERC is pushing as well. First of all, there is legislation that's out there with Senator Steve Daines in Montana and Dianne Feinstein with California. So you got a Republican and a Democrat coming together, recognizing the need to expedite these projects. So, regulatory relief, right? I mean, self-regulatory relief. The federal government's got to say, look, on this is a crisis. We need to loosen the reins and allow these projects to be expedited, and that's what the legislation helps to do. On the private side, there are financial interests that are interested in coming up and maybe getting a return on an investment for helping clear some of these forests. And this is a concept called a forest resiliency bond. So here you'd have a private capital enterprise come and offer to pay to do the cleanup of a forest. In this case, it might be a forest around a watershed, and the watershed supplies water to a town like Bozeman, real critical. If you had a massive wildfire up by the reservoirs up here in the National Forest, it could really damage the Bozeman water supply, right? So these private interests they will front the money to go clean up and manage the forest. So there's your revenue to do it, right? You don't need the appropriation from Congress. And what they would be looking for is a return from the water utility and the water authority over a period of time, right? So that's a way to get in, do it quicker, finance it, have private enterprise coming in and do this. The other is the mass timber construction industry. We've got this burgeoning. One of the challenges, a lot of the forests we see here, what you'll hear is, these are small diameter trees. Like big old growth trees are great because you can build houses with them. You can, big lumber, but small diameter is not as market feasible is what they'll say. But there's this emerging industry called mass timber construction.
Cross-laminated timber.
Exactly. And you guys are seeing this in the Pacific Northwest, where you can build buildings safely and structurally soundly with wood. Being able to convert wood into something not only you can build on its own, but there's a new technology that sort of supplements it into concrete, which makes a lighter concrete. So, the concrete industry could even look at this and go, hey, this is lighter for transporting concrete and beams and things like that. So there are markets emerging. That's one of the things Congressman Bruce Westerman of Arkansas, his legislation, he was just here in town a few weeks ago and we were talking about that. They're looking to incentivize that particular industry. So there are things we can do in the here and now, but I would say probably the most important thing are expediting these forest management projects that really need, we just need to stop dorking around with it and move forward. And I think everybody can agree, look, I'm a guy who says climate change is real. But this has to happen now. We can't sit around and wait for the big fixes. This is an easy fix that everybody should be able to get on.
That sort of approach of not everything that sounds good is good, I think is something that PERC has really had to live up to. It's like, it doesn't always sound good to go into a forest and have to clear it out or to turn forests into wood products. I think that we talked about this in our previous podcast, but it's kind of like that Lorax mentality, which is, it's an important message to send, to protect the environment. But at PERC, you guys work on a lot of topics like forest management, private land conservation, those sorts of things that maybe don't always sound as good to the broader public. How did we get to where we are right now in terms of kind of this hands-off approach? And why does this hands-on approach of conservation yield a better result for the climate and the environment in the short and long term?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think we can learn a lot from our private land stewards because they are hands-on managers of the land. You take, for example, we're in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem right here. So this is Yellowstone National Park, Grand Teton National Park, 6 national forests that surround those national parks, 3 national wildlife refuges, and private land. So private lands are about 28% of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. We're on some of the most pristine right now in Ted Turner's land. The wildlife choose to be here. Now, is that coincidental? No. A lot of the private lands manage appropriately, and wildlife make choices. Like they make choices. Do they want to go into the dense timber in the high country where they can't move around, where there's so much, so many trees up there and it's so tight? Or do they want to come out here to sort of the open river bottoms and kind of the rolling bench lands that we have here, and sort of the more better managed forests that are more open? So I think wildlife's a good indicator of some of what private stewardship is doing, and we often forget. I think people default to government as like conservation can only be done by government. It can only be done if it's the national parks or the Department of Interior or forestry. And they just forget that private lands, wild ecosystems are private lands and public lands. They don't recognize fences and boundaries. And wildlife don't recognize fences and boundaries too. They kind of move through the ecosystem. So we really need both. We need healthy public lands, but we need healthy private lands. And we can learn a lot from the private land.
Well, you almost mentioned it before we even got on camera. We have these bison behind us. It's the public, it's not the public lands, it's the private lands and the private commitment that saved the great American bison and gave us this opportunity to see some wild ones right there.
I'm a history geek, so I'm going to give you like a little history. I'm going to throw a little history your way. So bison, this is the national mammal in America. In 2016, Barack Obama actually signed legislation to make the bison the national mammal. So we actually have this national, and it's iconic. I mean, it's on the shield of the national parks and the Department of Interior. The bison is the image of America and the American West. But we almost lost the bison. I think a lot of folks know the story. I mean, we had, at one point in the 1800s, we had something between 30 to 60 million bison that were roaming across America. And through, some would say they call it market failure. We're with PERC. We call it government failure. This was a tragedy of the commons. Nobody owned the bison. Government didn't own the bison, and private individuals didn't own the bison. It was a resource free for the taking, and it created a bison derby. And folks just came in and eviscerated the bison, and a lot of that was encouraged by government policy. They wanted to take away sort of Native American food supplies. Industrial Revolution was going on. The bison hides were used as belts for the Industrial Revolution. All those factories in Britain and Northeast America for manufacturing, the bison hides were more durable than cattle hides, more durable than deer hides. That really built America. So we get ourselves into a position where, with this kind of tragedy of the commons, we get down to less than 1,000 bison in America. Think about that. Less than 1,000 of our national mammals exist. In Yellowstone, they counted only 25 bison left in Yellowstone National Park.
We saw more than 25 just driving through yesterday.
Yeah, we got into a bison traffic jam in Yellowstone.
So here's the good story. Here's the punchline: like private enterprise and innovation, right? So once you have scarcity, something becomes valuable. And a lot of entrepreneur ranchers, some of them who were actually former bison hunters, said, you know what? Bison at this point are more valuable alive than dead. I mean, there aren't a lot of bison left to go get. So they went out into the plains and the mountains, and they actually went out and gathered the last remaining bison and started to breed them to create these bisoners. Now, what was the value to them? A couple of things here. One, they could sell bison to zoos and to circuses. I mean, bison at that point were so rare, they were a curiosity, so they stood to make a lot of money that way. Plus, they also thought, in terms of their own cattle ranching, bison are pretty hardy when it comes to weather. When storms come in, bison are much better in storms and big, heavy snows than cattle are. Cattle will sort of pile up and, go the wrong way, and they'll move with the storm. Bison will go into the storm. They'll actually move into the storm and get them through quicker. So the ranchers, these private ranchers, said, well, maybe we breed these bison with cattle, and we create a hardier, sturdier version of our cattle that can weather the hard winters here in the plains. So the recovery happens through private ranchers doing this. Yellowstone, Congress actually appropriated funds to buy 22 private bison to supplement the meager 25 that were left in Yellowstone. So you go to Yellowstone today, there's actually a plaque that talks about the private ranch bison were the ones that helped recover the public Yellowstone bison herd. So let's flash forward to today, and Ted Turner, who will probably go down as one of America's greatest conservationists when all is said and done here. But he has been part of a movement to sort of single-handedly recover the bison as a species. It hasn't been the Endangered Species Act. Bison aren't on the Endangered Species. The Endangered Species Act didn't exist. It was genuinely private ranches that were creating a meat market, an alternate meat market, Bison is leaner. Bison doesn't have antibiotics. Bison is organic. It's kind of this locavore movement. Ted, comes and creates a restaurant chain, Ted's Montana Grill. He's got like 50 of these across America, where he's one of the major suppliers, but not the only supplier, because he wants to see other bison ranches, economically benefit too. So now the bison has economic value, right? You can sell it as meat, and it kind of pays its own way here. So here we are. We've gone from less than 1,000 bison. In America today, North America today, we have 500,000 bison. So this is truly a wildlife conservation success story. And the punchline on this is, of those 500,000 bison, only about 30,000 are on public conservation herds. The rest are all private ranch, private land bison herds. So really a great, I get excited and inspired about this story, because it's an example of how how private stewards can bring back wildlife, and it just doesn't have to be a government story.
I think that private stewardship story is something that we have talked a lot about already on this road trip that is basically just started. You see that when you have a investment and an incentive to take care of the forests or the bison or the sagebrush or whatever it is,
it's like, you do a better job.
Maybe just you can't say that, right? You can't say that, and
but that's what
true.
It's true.
We say that cows will never go extinct, right? Why won't cows go extinct? Because they have value, right? And so the more we can make wildlife an asset to folks, to landowners, and less of a liability. In some cases, wildlife can be a liability, and we expect people just to, wildlife is publicly owned. We have the North American wildlife model in America. It means it's a public trust. The public own wildlife. An individual doesn't own wildlife, but we expect the individuals that own the habitat that wildlife come on, and that sometimes wildlife can damage and create economic costs, to just eat those costs and absorb them. And what we say is, look, to have like ranches and farms being financially viable is a worthy economic goal, but it's a worthy conservation goal. If we keep these ranches and farms that have wildlife on them viable, and we keep them in the families, at the end of the day, wildlife's going to do better across the board, and we just need to think of creative ways to compensate the folks that actually provide this public benefit to the rest of us.
Think of Green Diamond, Benji. Think of Vaughan Timbers. These are two over 150-year-old logging companies in Washington. You go into their forests, they don't talk about just trying to cut down all the forests. They talk about trying to maintain the forest, keeping them healthy. And it's one of my biggest worries driving up here to Montana. You go through Yellowstone, and it feels like some of the forests there could light on fire. You kind of goes to that national parks mentality where we're putting out everything, and we might lose some of these great treasures in our attempt to preserve them.
Yeah, it's, I roll back to sort of first principles, and I think incentives matter at the end of the day. And when we talk about, PERC is the home of free market environmentalism. We're a 40-year-old organization. We kind of pioneered this approach to the environment where markets and property rights can be used for the good. Capitalism can be used for the good, not for the bad, which you hear all the time, right? And incentives matter. So, if we can find, I like to say there's negative incentives and there's positive incentives. Negative incentives, regulation, litigation. If you're a landowner, how do you respond to that? Do you want to have an endangered species on your property? Do you want to take care of your property if it's going to invite extra government scrutiny? Generally not. Positive incentives are through markets. That's voluntary cooperation. If people come together, a great example, the Nature Conservancy. So most of this ranch is put into a conservation easement, right? So what happens here is Ted Turner has a property right. Like, he can do what he wants with his property. He can develop it. He can make it a beautiful ranch. Where we're sitting here, this is spectacular. I call it Turner Stone, right? You got Yellowstone, and then you got Turner Stone, right? Just over the mountain here is Big Sky. It's a ski resort. It's, developing out. It's the anti-Turner Stone when you look at it, right? And Ted Turner could have done that here, but he chose not to. So what ends up happening is you get like an organization, this is how free market environmentalism really works, an organization like the Nature Conservancy that goes out to get conservation easements to essentially buy or be gifted the property right that Ted Turner has ranches that he gives away, or in some cases, in a lot of ranchers, they'll sell it to a nature conservancy. That's the voluntary trade that we have right now, and there's a tax benefit that comes with a conservation easement. And if you can sell your property rights. A rancher could sell their property rights to the TNC. TNC would buy those, and then they would start caring, and monitoring the land for conservation as well. And we need more of that out there than sort of the model of let's go sue and do big old command and control environmental.
I totally agree, and I think, just to jump in with kind of an anecdote, you guys were also a major player in getting that funding for the national parks. You know that there's an important role that the national parks play. So it's this balance of kind of this national paired with private sector, paired with state, and everything like that. But we're focusing on the private sector side right now. How do we replicate this sort of initiative that Ted Turner has created to protect the land that elk want to mate in, that bison want to, return to life in, that, the forests are incredibly managed? How can we replicate that across the country? And what is PERC working on that helps kind of expand these efforts past just people like Ted Turner?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think, probably the top thing we can do is support our private land stewards, right, at the end of the day. With so much land, in private ownership, we're over 60% of America is privately held, getting close to 70% of America is privately held. So we really need to help the land stewards that are there now. And one of the ways we're doing that is pretty close to here. A couple valleys over is a place called Paradise Valley. Y'all are familiar with the TV show Yellowstone? It's kind of a famous show these days. I guess Kevin Costner and sweeping across America. Everybody's binge watching it. Well, that actually takes place in a place called Paradise Valley, which is where I have a little cabin there. And Paradise Valley is known. That's a place where elk migrate out of Yellowstone. So this is a great connection between public and private land story. The elk spend the summer up in the high country of Yellowstone. In the winter, they come down to the lower country, which is the river bottoms along the Paradise Valley. Well, the ranches are all along the river bottoms. And so what happens is, these are kind of mom and pop ranches, multi-generational ranches. But the whole valley is essentially ranch. And the elk will come down. They will knock fences down when they get to the ranch. They will eat the forage that was designed for the cows to get the cows through the winter, right? So ranchers now have to go out and buy more hay to supplement their cow herds. They'll trample crops in the case of farming, if they're growing alfalfa or other things, the elk will come down. And then more importantly is they will bring the danger of a disease called brucellosis. So this is a disease that has originated with bison in Yellowstone, and it gets passed to elk, and then elk are the vectors that bring them to these private ranches. And it can cause cows, actual cattle cows, to abort their fetuses. So if you're a cow-calf operation in Paradise Valley and you've got elk on your land, you're essentially having this threat to wipe out your entire cow-calf herd by having elk there. So we as PERC, are working with these ranchers to find market-based tools to help them cope with the presence of elk. We don't want them, they want to be good wildlife stewards, but they also want to be good ranchers, and they want to be able to keep their ranches and their family and not sell to development, which, being as close as Paradise Valley is to Bozeman, this huge threat of that valley being turned over into development. So there are risk tools, like insurance tools, where maybe conservation groups and people like us who love elk actually pay the premiums for a insurance risk tool to cover the ranchers in case of a catastrophic outbreak of brucellosis where they'd have to quarantine their cows for a long time. Or maybe there are elk occupancy agreements where we actually separate the elk and the cows for 3 months, a period of time where the threat is the worst, and actually have conservation organizations and funders pay for that. Or maybe we set up a conservation elk compensation fund. When wolves were reintroduced here in Yellowstone, the wolves were predating cattle, and the conservation groups like Defenders of Wildlife that knew that was a problem set up a fund, and they said, we will pay, our members will pay into the fund, and then we'll pay you ranchers if a cow or sheep is depredated by wolf.
So we got about 5 minutes left here. I want to kind of drive the conversation towards it really feels like partnerships at every level. You're looking for the government to be a steward, to not overregulate, but then almost incentivize the people who know how, be it a cross-laminated timber company to go into, be it Turner Stone and sign a contract to collect the trees and turn it into, housing. I'd love to live in a house that was built with cross-laminated Yellowstone timber, right? What can we do to get the government to be a little less heavy-handed, but also to bring these people in as, it feels like we don't have enough time. The smoke's still here. We have to act right now.
Right. Well, and, on the public side, we have to incentivize even our public land managers, right? We talk about incentives for private and markets being for private, but it's better to have a superintendent in Yellowstone having real decision-making authority and forest supervisors in these individual forests, not having to go to Washington, not having to deal with bureaucracy, not having decisions of how to manage land being pushed down by Congress or by bureaucracy. So we really need mechanism. We need to give more authority to those local land managers. Most of these issues are not going to be federal solutions at the end of the day being pushed down from Zeus, on top of Mount Olympus. This is local knowledge. I mean, that's one of the big things about free market environmentalism. There's this recognition that most of these issues are local, time, place, knowledge issues, and the people who are going to know best are going to be people in these forests, in these individual valleys. So we've got to empower them, and we've got to let them make the decisions at the end of the day. And then, we need to support the markets that are there. I mean, it's easy. I bump into this every day. The default solution is always, let's go to Washington. Mm-hmm. Let's go get a bill passed. Yeah, let's go give a speech. Let's go, grandstand and do this. The hard thing is to give incentives to the people who we want to do the conserving, to make conservation make economic sense for the people we want to do conserving. It's a lot of work out there. And so oftentimes it's not the first thing looked at. So I think markets and voluntary cooperation, that should be the first, conservation's like Baskin-Robbins ice cream. There's like 31 flavors, right? and the first flavor, vanilla, chocolate, whatever it is, should be free market environmentalism because that's voluntary. And when you have something that's cooperative, it becomes immune to politics at the end of the day. Whether Barack Obama's president or Trump is president or somebody else is president. You saw this with Barack Obama. He passed all this environmental legislation. Trump came in, modified the environmental legislation. Whoever the next president is, however long that is, will come in and do something different. And everybody gets frustrated. It's like, nope. If you had voluntary incentive-based conservation, it would withstand because conservation groups would be happy. The stewards who were asking, the private land stewards would be happy. There'd be agreement and there'd be some sustainable environmentalism going forward.
Well, and that politics first approach of environmentalism is really flawed because we all know that politics is incredibly slow. Congress doesn't move very quickly, but it also is relying on a few hundred people to make decisions for something that everyone has a stake in, right? Like every person has a stake in the environment. And what it really comes down to at the end of the day is that you know how to take care of your literal backyard better than the government knows how to take care of your literal backyard. And that doesn't mean that by and large, the government doesn't have a role in working with us on environmental concerns, but we've gotten away from this idea of empowering the individual or the business or the family or the ranchers or we've gotten away from all of that kind of private level incentivization that we need to actually take care of our environment. And I think that that's the story of Ted Turner is that he's made it obvious that when someone's inspired to take care of their land, like Ted Turner has been, you yield the best results. And as you said earlier, you yield somebody who is probably going to go down as one of the best conservationists of all time. He didn't hold elected office. He wasn't a congressperson. He made these decisions because it was the best thing for the environment and it was something he cared about, and he's made historical changes.
Well, the proof's right behind us. Look at how he did a global revolution. He's a global conservationist, but then he maintains his lands better than anyone else on Earth.
So much so that we have 3 bison behind us. Who haven't charged us yet.
That's a big win, by the way. I've been kind of like a little nervous, but I think...
Yeah, word of advice for all the listeners and viewers, don't pet the bison. Let the bison...
What if they're really cute, though?
Don't pet the bison. They could be cute and shaggy, and don't pet the bison. No, and Ted actually, so much of it is altruism, but he's also a believer in the economics of conservation, too. Like, he recognizes that there's an enormous cost. Like, the payment to manage this pristine land what he has to pay to do it, to take care of the land, is a high cost. And so he looks for ways to have wildlife sort of pay itself. And so we talk about like the bison market. Ted has elk here on the land, which are, probably 1,500 elk sort of move through here. And he'll charge a good penny for somebody to come and hunt elk on the property or to take a bison. But, that's not profit when we think of, that's going into Ted's to go buy something else. That's being plowed right back into the land right here to take care and do the conservation he wants to see.
Well, it brings it back to really Ron Allen, a tribal leader that we met with out in Sequim, who, talked a lot about how he needs his economy to grow so that they can invest in their environment. I feel like it's forgotten so much that without growth, we can't make these awesome strides, invest in cleaning up our forests, bring back the bison. This is an economic game and a capitalistic world that we live in.
Right. And think about property rights too, whether it's a forest, how can we more infuse property rights in the forest manager, obviously private property rights. Property rights or ownership is a stewardship component, right? I mean, think about the car you own, right, is the car you wash. When's the last time you've gone out and washed your rental car? You haven't done that, right? Because there's ownership matters at the end of the day. So ownership can equal stewardship.
Which is not clean. And
you guys might be the exception to the rule, right?
No, well, we're not going to clean it over the course of the trip, are we?
Oh, I'm washing it after this. With that message, I'm taking that home. That went right to my heart. We're kind of at the end, but Benji and I have been kind of ending each conversation asking individuals, Brian, what's your advice for us? We're doing this big, hairy, audacious trip. What are you hoping we find, and what story do you hope we tell to Americans across the country?
Yeah, no, I mean, first of all, welcome to Montana. I know this is kind of the first leg of the trip here, and we love having you in Big Sky country.
Does it? If it doesn't get, I don't think you can get it any better than
it's tough. I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, where you're going next?
Never mind.
Across the country.
Okay.
Well, I think we have the prettiest spot and the best ecosystems and wildlife. But I think when you go out there, look at innovation. Look at the enviropreneurs, the entrepreneurs that are fixing the environment, because they're out there and they don't get enough attention. And those kind of stories need to be told. And we need to bring people together. Like, this country is so divided, right? But conservation is something we can all coalesce around. And so let's find those stories and let's find those projects and let's find conservation that's more cooperative, that actually bring people together. I mean, I'm sick of seeing fights over this. I think there's a lot that can be done in sort of this voluntary, voluntary, innovative way. So look for that. Be inspired by Ted Turner. He should inspire us all.
Well, he's removed politics from this because it's not about that for him. Right. And, he might lean left or whatever, but it doesn't matter. You might lean right, it doesn't matter because this is what we've got to take care of. And unlike other issues, it's actually one that we can unite people around. And we're going to have people who are super liberal and super conservative on this podcast. And we're going to have enviropreneurs, and we're going to have people that work for the government and everyone in between, because we all have this important stake in it. And we're also going to have matching outfits.
We're going to have matching outfits, too. Well, look, hey, and have hope also. I love what ACC does. I love getting into the colleges. If I was a college student, I would be despair, because all you hear is just negative, and the world's coming to an end, and there's nothing we can do, and it's hopelessness, and it's despair. Forget about it. Conservation optimism's the new philosophy, right? And you're going to bring that to college campuses.
Conservation optimism is the new philosophy. How about that?
We're finding it on the Electric Election Road Trip. Tune in for more episodes real soon.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks.
Psych! They thought we were going to be somewhere else, because that's what we've been doing on the After Show podcast. But
maybe we are somewhere else, and this green screen is just really intense.
You really want everyone to believe we're just at home and green screening this entire trip.
We're actually not driving around the country in a Tesla. We're just driving out of our driveway to go get snacks.
We're just staying in the basement. Either way, with the After Show podcast episode, I think number 7, but I get a little lost here.
It's in the single digits. We know that much.
Yeah, but we're out of Washington now. We just had an awesome conversation with the executive director of PERC, Brian Yablonski. Benji, what was your biggest takeaway from this one, other than it's just good to get out of Seattle?
It is great to get out of Seattle, but it's also just inspiring to kind of hear this private conservation lens, right? That, he admitted, climate change is a big problem that we need to tackle. And, we talked the entire, 25 minutes about the importance of involving the individual on that issue and conservation in general, with wildlife management, forest management, just land management in general. And that balance of the government working with individuals and empowering individuals, not just like telling individuals what to do, but saying, okay, Ted Turner, you know how to take care of your land better than anyone else, so you should be able to do that.
Well, and how can we learn from you to take care of our land better? I think that's where the federal government, they're totally fine to let Ted be here and maintain this pristine land, but maybe they're not working on actually learning the lessons from that. And that's where, I think we do need to do a better job. It came out in this conversation a lot that we're not going to find the answers for local land management from Washington, D.C. In fact, it has to almost be a reverse. Washington, D.C. and their goal to create this global revolution needs to come here. And learn from the individuals who built this ranch and maintain it.
Well, I mean, we just drove a few hours yesterday, and there's a huge difference between taking care of land in Jackson, Wyoming, and Bozeman, Montana. And so you can't have kind of this one-size-fits-all approach of like, we're going to put the same restrictions and the same rules on everywhere. And that doesn't mean, again, that there isn't a role for the federal government to play. But what it means is that instead of like having the federal government tell local communities what to do, it should be local communities that are working with the federal government and the state government and everyone else, the powers that be, businesses, etc., to say, this is how to best take care of my backyard. And I mean, that was the analogy I used. Like, Brian Yablonski knows how to take care of his backyard, his literal backyard, better than somebody else because he has a stake in it and because he's lived there.
Well, and I mean, the rental metaphor, that crushed me because in a way, we're renting this. This is not my Tesla. We are renting this Tesla. We're borrowing it.
We wish it was our Tesla.
We wish it was our Tesla. And I literally had to look at the car when he said that. And I have not watched it. And it's right. We need to stop renting America's lands. We can't treat America's lands like it's a rental. This is it.
This is a lifelong investment that's lifelong as not just as our lives, but our future generations.
Right.
And we act like it's just within our lifetime and that we're just going to come on this land for a week and then leave. And it's like, yes, we need to be exposed to this land, but we also have to have a stake in it. And that's what the power of Ted Turner's ranch really is.
Well, and what I'm left with, Benji, is, I'm glad that there are climate change activists out there. I think they have an important role. But I'm sitting here with you. We're building trust with people because you're not a climate change activist. You're a climate action activist. You're literally taking action. And I think that's what I want people to take away from this conversation is we have to take more action, and it's not going to happen at a federal level. It's going to happen at a local level, and that's how we're going to protect our forests. That's how we're going to build a better renewable energy grid. And each part of the United States is going to find different answers.
And we can replicate those sorts of solutions locally, nationally, and internationally, because those sorts of solutions are definitely available to be administered all over the globe if they're actually tried. And it's much easier to try them in local communities.
But the joke is we're going to take the idea here, we're going to bring it international, but then it's going to be enacted locally again, right?
Exactly.
You got to have the people living here have investment, have skin in the game, and not feel like the U.S. government is just forcing
their hand.
Well, enforce fires. Like I'm getting a little angry, and I haven't let it out on any of these conversations, but we need to shift how we talk about forest management. And if another person tries to talk to me about global warming, what we're doing 10 years down the line, without having a serious conversation about how we can invest in protecting our forests right now with the companies that we have met with who can make a difference. Like, everybody's got to pull their head out from under the sands, Republicans and Democrats, and get to work. I
can't top that. That's exactly how I feel.
Well, we're getting to work on this podcast. We are getting to work on the after show. I think this is going to be the last one in Bozeman, Montana, even though I kind of want to just set up camp and live with the bison.
It is, we can't tell them that yet, though. We don't know where we're going to be next, so we can't say.
Saul Spady still not knowing where he's going to be next. See you on the next section, next episode of the Electric Election Podcast.